Thank you, Professor Yamagishi. Aki-san. The hour is late. This is the last talk this morning before we adjourn. And this will be a relatively short talk. I'm just going to tell you a couple of stories about Alexander Ivanovich Oparin. And they're sort of personal stories, but I hope that you'll find them of some interest. The first story I'm going to talk about is the history of Oparin's insight into the problem of the origin of life. And then I'll end by telling you of a little visit to the home of the surrealist painter, the Spanish surrealist painter, Salvador Dali, that I had an opportunity to go with Alexander Ivanovich in 1973. Okay. The history of Oparin's insight into this problem of the origin of life starts with Darwin and goes through Clement Tiberyazev to Oparin to us. Here is Darwin in a studio photograph in 1856, 3 years before publication of On the Origin of Species. And in this book, he does not talk about the origin of life. He's talking about the evolution of life. But there is a famous letter that he wrote to his friend, the botanist, Joseph Hooker, in 1871, which is about the only speculation that Darwin has made about the origin of life. He says, "If, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm pond with all sorts of ammonia," going back to that slide, all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric acid, salts, light, history, and so forth, a protein compound chemically formed, ready to undergo more complex changes. He envisions his small little pond with the origin of life, but then he says, "But this could never happen now, of course, because at the present day, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before the living creatures had formed. It would have been eaten up and gone and never knew," and so forth and so on. And that's what Darwin said, okay? That is the beginnings of this. And we go from Darwin then to Alexander Ivanovich Oparin. This is a photo I took in 1973. Okay, well, it is useful now to tell you the roots or the source of the story I'm going to tell you. And that is when A.I. Oparin, academic Oparin, came to my laboratory and spent 2.5 months with me in 1976. And of course, he did not speak English. He had one good English phrase that many of you will remember. It is, "Thank you very much." Thank you very much. That is his one English phrase, "thank you very much." This is the class that I put together that he would teach, and this actually is my Russian teacher who I got to translate for him. I would not try to translate to my class. Anyway, that's in 1976 at the University of California in Los Angeles, and I point out that that individual in the middle, who looks a little sad for some reason, is our good and dear friend Antonio Lascano, who is just up here speaking English with a Mexican-Spanish accent. Okay, there we are, and that's our class. And I asked Oparin, I knew the story, but I asked him, I had these students into my laboratory, and we had lunch together, and I asked him to tell the students how he got interested in the problem of the origin of life. And so I will tell you what he told me and told my class. Let us go back first to the situation in the late 1800s. Now, in the Western world, but also here in Russia before the Soviet days, the origin of life was regarded as a theological question, not a scientific question. And there were very few scientists who speculated even about the origin of life because that was handled by theology, by religion. And those who did speculate on it knew the following. They knew the very basics of biology, that animals, heterotrophs, eat plants. Okay? If you read Osborne up to 1917, they said, okay, animals eat plants. You have to have plants or plant-like organisms to evolve before animals, because you've got to have something for the plants to eat. And so therefore, before the plants, autotrophs, had to come first to provide food for these heterotrophs that would eat them. And that was the general statement that people would make. Oparin had a different view. Oparin had spent, in his early days, doing some simple experiments on plants. And he'd read a good deal about botany, and was interested in biochemistry even as a high school student. And he realized that plants were more complicated biochemically than animals, in the sense that plants build organics by photosynthesis, and they break down organics by metabolism. Whereas an animal can only break down things. You cannot photosynthesize. You are a heterotroph. Ah, says Oparin, he says, well, I think that the history of life must go from the simple to the complex. But look at this. Plants are more complex because they can both make food and break it down, whereas animals are very simple. So he said, this is the root of what A.I. Oparin fundamentally contributed to human knowledge. He said, let us look at this, my friends. Life evolved from simple to complex. Plants are more complex than animals, therefore animal-like things, heterotrophs, must have come first. Now, what do plants do? Plants produce oxygen through photosynthesis. So if plants were not there first, that animals or heterotrophs were, then the early Earth would be without oxygen. And if that is the case, then he postulated that if there's no oxygen, organic matter could form by non-biological processes and make up a primordial soup of some sort. So life formed from and fed on this primordial soup. That is the basis of what A.I. Oparin's hypothesis was. That's the fundamental aspect of what he contributed. Okay, well, that's just fine. And that is called the heterotrophic hypothesis, life from a primordial soup. Well, where did that idea come from? How did he get that idea? What is its history? Okay, well, there are three players in this play, three actors in this play. Darwin, Clement Timiryazev, the botanist, and A.I. Oparin. Now, Oparin was born and raised in a small town called UGLITCH, which is up the Volga River northeast of Moscow. And my wife and I, thanks to Mikhail Sergeyevich some years ago, had the opportunity to go up to UGLITCH, and here we are on academic Oparin Street. It's Oparins Ulica in UGLITCH. It's right there, and you will see pictures of it in the volume that you have been given. When he was a young man, he was doing these experiments on botany. He took the examinations in 1912 to be admitted to the university. He and another student in his high school were, this is his story, told to us, he and his friend were to be escorted to Moscow State University because they had passed the examination and were admitted to Moscow State University in the Lenin Hills to be a student. They missed the morning train. They were coming down by train from UGLITCH to Moscow. They missed the train and took the afternoon train. And when they arrived at the university, they had time to go to only one lecture. This was their visit to the university before they came to be students. They were still seniors in high school. And so Oparin was asked whose lecture he wanted to hear. And he said, well, I want to go hear Clement Timiryazev. Why? Because Timiryazev was a popularizer of botanical science. He was the leader of Darwinian evolutionary science in Russia. This is during the Tsar's day. This is 1912. Okay? But he was outspoken. He was a good lecturer. And he was at that age, at that time, was 69 years old. Here is Timiryazev, a Russian biochemist, a Russian botanist. Here's the 150-year Russian commemorative ruble. Here is the Timiryazev yacht. I mean, it's a boat that they take tours on. It's not really his boat, but here he is. And you'll find a statue of him here in Moscow. He was quite well known and very famous. In any case, he was 69 years old. This was either the last lecture he gave at the university or the next to the last lecture he gave. Oparin had the opportunity to hear it, and Timiryazev spent the time telling the students in his class how he, Timiryazev, had become interested in evolution, because he was an outspoken evolutionist, which was not popular in Tsarist Russia. And so he said, my father, Timiryazev said, my father was a professor here at Moscow State University, and when I got my doctorate degree and so forth, I asked my father if he could provide funds so that I could go to England, Timiryazev could go to England to meet Darwin. So he went to Darwin's house. Here, when Timiryazev at that time, Darwin was 61, and Timiryazev was 27. He has just graduated, got his PhD. He goes to England, and he goes to Darwin's house. This is Down House. I always wondered why it was called Down House. Down, the downs in English sort of vernacular, downs are rolling hills outside of London at a place called Kent. And this is Darwin's home, okay? So, Timiryazev went there, and he went to meet Darwin. Darwin didn't know he was coming. Darwin in those days was ill much of the time. He was not a well man physically. And so Timiryazev came up and sat on this little stoop here, waiting and waiting to see Darwin, but Darwin didn't come. So he went down the road to Luxford Road to the Queen's Head Pub, and he rented this room right here, which still exists today. That's my photograph. That's not his photograph. That is there today. And that's where he stayed for a week. And each day he would walk up the road and he would sit on the stoop. And he wasn't around for me to take a picture, so that's me, and my wife took the picture, but that's where Timiyazev sat. So he's sitting there and waiting, and finally, after a week, Oparin comes down, and they walked out on the sand pebble path behind. It's about 2 kilometers or so around the back end of the house, and they talked of evolution, and Timiyazev became convinced about evolution. And so then Timiyazev comes back and becomes a professor at Moscow State University, and Oparin's a young man, and Oparin's at the age of 18. Timiyazev is at the age of 69 at this point, and so Timiyazev tells the class, and Oparin says to himself, he says to himself, now look, Darwin revealed the evolution of animals, and Timiyazev showed the evolution of plants, but no one had written the first chapter of the book, How Life Originated. That is where A.I. Oparin, Alexander Ivanovich, said that his idea to work on the problem of the origin of life came from. Okay, well, how was it received? And what did he do next? Well, actually, he wrote up this in the next 6 years, and by 1918 had submitted a manuscript, he said, which was rejected because he said that the Tsar, even though the Russian Revolution was 1917, he said that the Tsar's censors were still in power, and his manuscript had been rejected. But he said that was a good thing because he had been 1918 to 1922 before he presented it publicly, and then 1924 to write it up. He said he had that additional time to put together what he called affectionately his little pamphlet on the origin of life. And so he tells us this story, and here he is at the age of 72, and he comes to talk to us at UCLA. And this has impressed me quite a lot, because you see, we think Darwin was an old man long time ago, and he's not. He's only 3 generations back. Darwin to Timiyazev. Darwin is an old man to Timiyazev as a young man, 27. Timiyazev as an old man to Oparin as a young man who's 18, and Oparin to us. You know, I mean, we are direct descendants of Charles Darwin. To me, that's really kind of amazing, because you don't think of that way, but it's really true. Okay, well, Oparin presents these ideas, but Oparin had the notion that theory could stand alone. And that was typical of the old Soviet times. It was really true. There wasn't a whole lot of equipment to do a whole lot of research, for some people anyway. In any case, Oparin was a theoretician. He did work on coacervates, but he didn't work on the primary problem, and that is it true that there really was a primordial soup? That was not experimentally demonstrated, okay? And so, and besides, you see, this fit Marxist materialism. This is a realistic view of the origin of life, which was at odds with the religious views of the origin of life. So that's Oparin's view, but the Western view was that, well, gosh, you need experimental backing. We have to be able to see that there really was a primordial soup, and besides which it's politically suspect. Now, you folks nowadays, especially you students, you do not understand the history of how evolution and natural selection and political systems and capitalism and communism and socialism are all intertwined. There's a thing, read Spencer on social Darwinism. Darwinism and natural selection was used to justify capitalism because it would be the survival of the fittest. And if you weren't good enough to do the job, you could die. That'd be perfectly fine, because we're capitalists by time. You know, and you have to see how these things, and in the Western world, after the 1917 revolution, and you go up through the 30s and the Depression and the Second World War, people in the West were very afraid that capitalism was going to be overtaken by communism. And so there's all this mix of science and of politics, and it just is amazing. But you cannot talk about this problem without realizing that it has this historical background. So if you haven't read that, read it, because it will educate you and let you understand why it took so long for Oparin's views to become accepted universally. And in fact, it wasn't until 1953, with the work of Stanley Miller, and the Miller-Urey Synthesis, working with Nobel laureate Harold Urey on the abiotic synthesis of organic matter, something you're all familiar with, making amino acids in the first place. Incidentally, those amino acids, if you read the paper in 1953, were analyzed by paper chromatography. Paper chromatography, I mean, they're not GCMS and stuff. Paper chromatography. This is like, you know, cavemen. It's back in the Neanderthal days. All right. In any case, we've done this in my lab. That happens to be one of the experiments that we've done. And that's a Miller-Urey synthesis after 24 hours, and you can see you make a whole lot of organic matter. It's quite efficient if you have a lot of hydrogen. Okay, so there we are. And so the story of how Oparin got this idea, in 1918, he gets the idea from Timiryazev. He gets interested in it in 1912. 1918, he writes a manuscript that's rejected by the Tsar's censors still in power. 1922, he presents it to the Botanical Society. 1924, he publishes it in Russian, but it's in Russian, and it's unknown in the West. No one knew about that 1924 paper in the West because of the tension between the East and the West. And then in 1929, J.W.S. Haldane in England, a very famous British botanist, came up with essentially the same idea. But in the West, his ideas were not accepted. Even though it was the Oparin sort of idea, it was a good idea, it wasn't accepted because he, like many intellectuals in England, in the United States, throughout the West, they were socialists and communists and therefore regarded as suspect. Okay, so he had leftist ideas, so his ideas were suspect. Then comes along 1938, the 1936 publication in Russian, translated into an expanded version of Oparin's book, translated into English 1938 by Macmillan Company, published in London. It had wide impact, yet there still was skepticism because of the political background and as it was viewed in the West. Okay, and then comes along the 1953 Miller-Urey experiment, the first real world backing, saying that yes, it was conceivable. In fact, there was a primordial soup, that Alexander Ivanovich Oparin was correct, that this is the foundation. That's where all this stuff comes from. Okay, so it goes Darwin to Timiryazev to Oparin to Miller to us. And now I tell you the second story. Well, I just covered, 50, 60, 80, 100 years of history in 10 minutes. Now, Oparin's 1973 visit to Dali's home. This is 3 years before Alexander Ivanovich came to visit me at UCLA. The International Society for the Study of the Origin of Life in 1973 met at Barcelona, Spain. The organizer was Juan Oro. You've seen his name. He is the first person to do the adenine synthesis, the prebiotic adenine synthesis. And up here in Girona, Spain, is where Salvador Dali lives. Now, who is this Salvador Dali? Well, this is not Salvador Dali. This is Stanley Miller, a picture that I took in 1973, just to show you that he still existed in 1973. This is the Miller-Urey man. Okay, that was in Barcelona. Now, a caravan, well, a minivan of the invitees went up the road from Barcelona up to Girona, Spain, and here is Salvador Dali, who was a friend of Juan Oro, or John Oro, the organizer of the meeting, and consequently, Dali, in fact, drew the artwork for the official publication of that particular conference. Dali was an eccentric individual. He was quite unusual in many respects. He was a surrealist, and here he is in all of his glory. He really looks like that too, with these big eyeballs and things. His work, his artwork, is shown throughout the world. And this Last Supper is at the Louvre in London, in Paris, and some of his other iconic work, as you can see. He was a real showman. When he came to New York at one time to publicize himself, he walked, there's a big road in New York called Fifth Avenue, a very broad avenue. And he walked down the middle of Fifth Avenue with a diving helmet on his a diver who goes down into the ocean, a diving helmet on his head with goldfish swimming around inside this dive. I do not know why he did such things except to get into the newspaper and sell his art. He was quite an unusual man. In any case, you get to Dali's home, and I asked him, he was there, I asked him and had a little conversation about his home. He said that he had bought the homes of 3 fishermen, and he had put them together, and you go in down here, and then you have to sort of wind your way through a tunnel. Now this tunnel was rather about the size of this podium or something, a little smaller, and unfortunately it was too small for Alexander Ivanovich to get in. So they took him around to the back way, and we all met, and the rest of us paraded through this tunnel. The tunnel, Dali said that he had it built that way because he had been incarcerated by the Franco regime, and he wanted to show how he was against Franco. This is after Franco had been deposed, but it turns out that he was only in jail for 6 days, and he was really trying to ingratiate himself with the Spanish people so that he could sell some more art. Anyhow, when you get to this place, you see his home, and the first thing that strikes your your eye is this odd situation in front. There's a boat with a tree growing out of it, which I took that picture, thought was rather strange that I hadn't seen a boat with a tree growing out of it before. You walk up into the front door and you're greeted by a large bear. Now, this happens not to be the bear that was there in 1973. This is the bear that is now at the entrance to the Dali Museum because, and so I got this off the internet, but there was a brown bear, not a white bear, and it had on it all of Senor Dali's medals, and he had many art medals, and and this bear had medals around its neck and all this fits out like that. And so I got out my camera, and I was going to take a picture of this thing, and this nice lady comes up, and she's all dressed in had white and black and little hat. You know, she's the maid, and she's very formal. And she's like, oh, senor, you must not take picture. Must not take picture. The senor, that is Salvador Dali, the senor has his own private photographer. And you cannot take pictures here. This is the senor's home. So I put my camera back in my pouch and went through the tunnel and got up to the backyard, and there it turns out that Alexander Ivanovich was talking with Salvador Dali. Now, it turns out that Salvador Dali could speak English and Spanish, but could not speak Russian. And Alexander Ivanovich could speak Russian, and his thank you very much, but no other English. And I was the only one around who could speak Nimanuchka Paruski. So I end up, Alexander Ivanovich, come on over here. So I end up translating between Dali and Alexander Ivanovich, and they were exchanging platitudes. What was it? Очень интересный. Oh God, very interesting. It was vacuous. In any case, Alexander Ivanovich says to me, "Say my pictures." And I'm looking around, you know, for the official photographer, but the official photographer was over there someplace outside having a cigarette. Now, Dali had to be polite to Alexander Ivanovich because he was the guest of honor. And so Dali says, "Oh yes, well now go take a picture." You know? So I took a picture. So there's my picture. That's my picture of Dali and Oparin. And I figured, well, since I had been given permission to take a picture, I could take a few more. See? So there I took another one, and there's Nina Petrovna, and we're having pink champagne. And there are about 10 of us there, and we're drinking our champagne and having our canapes and walking around his backyard. And you get to this part of the backyard, and this is his reflecting pool. And this thing is a cupola from the Middle East. It's a kind of a religious thing. And then right here in the middle of it, this is the light of a lighthouse. I don't understand exactly the symbolism here, but anyway, there's a lighthouse sitting inside this cupola. And here's Salvador Dali and Juan Oro, and I think this picture is probably in the book, but that's a picture I took in '73. There they are, Juan Oro and Nina Petrovna and Alexander Ivanovich and Salvador Dali having a joyous time. So I walked around a little bit and took just a couple more photographs when nobody was looking, and I happened upon this. Now, I knew a little bit about Salvador Dali's art, but this is the original. This is an iconic love seat shaped like the lips of a person named Mae West. You may not know Mae West, but she was regarded as a voluptuous actress in American films, and apparently she looks sort of like lips, and here she is, and one of her famous lines is, "So many men and so little time." Think about it, so many men and so little time. Now just think never mind. Okay, anyway, that's Mae West. That's Mae West, and those are her lips. And my wife says she's not very pretty, but anyway, and then finally I walked around the backyard, and up on the backyard fence is this, which is a full-size paper-mache camel, on the side of which it says, "Smoke Camel Cigarettes." Now that was 1973. This has now been made into a national museum, and they've taken down the camel. I don't know where the camel went, but Mae West's lips are still there. Okay, well, there you have my two little stories, from Darwin to Timiyaza, to Oparin, to Miller, a visit to Dali's home, and to us. And the point of all this, in terms of the science, is really twofold. One, science builds on past progress, and you've seen that from Darwin to Timiyaza, to Oparin, to us, and to this meeting. And the second thing is that science is a lot of fun. It can be a lot of fun, and that trip to Dali's home was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.